On the night of June 5, 1944, a German radio intercept team in northern France picked up a coded BBC broadcast and recognized exactly what it meant. The Allied invasion of Europe was coming within 48 hours. The officer in charge passed the warning up the chain, and the entire 15th Army went on full alert. What nobody realized at the time was that the one army actually defending the Normandy coast would never receive that warning, because on this single night, every layer of the German command structure was about to fail at once. In the spring of 1944, the BBC was broadcasting from London every evening on a French-language program whose title translated to "The French Speak to the French." It was run by free French broadcasters who had escaped occupied France, and it served as a direct counter to German-controlled Radio Paris and Vichy's Radio Diffusion Nationale. But Radio Londres, as the service was widely known, also carried coded operational messages to specific French resistance cells buried inside its regular programming. The messages were deliberately absurd-sounding personal notices, lines like, "Jean has a long mustache," and "There is a fire at the insurance agency." Each one was meaningless to any casual listener, but carried precise operational instructions for the specific resistance group that had been briefed on its meaning in advance. Those meanings were relayed by courier, never transmitted over the air, and the Germans, despite monitoring the broadcasts constantly, could not keep up with deciphering the volume of them. One set of coded messages was different, though, because German intelligence already knew exactly what it signaled. In January 1944, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of German military intelligence, personally briefed Lieutenant Colonel Helmuth Meyer, the 15th Army's intelligence officer, about a specific pair of coded lines drawn from Paul Verlaine's 1866 poem, Chanson d'automne. Canaris told Meyer that the poem's opening line would serve as a general alert to certain resistance sabotage networks that the invasion of France was coming within roughly 2 weeks. The second half of the poem would mean that action was to begin within 48 hours. On the night of June 1st, Meyer's radio intercept team picked up the first line of the poem on the BBC broadcast. Meyer informed his superiors immediately, and the 15th Army's Chief of Staff alerted the entire army. The specific message was aimed at Philippe de Vaumecourt's ventriloquist network, based in the Sologne region south of Orléans, ordering fighters to prepare for sabotage of communication routes within 7 days. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. The 15th Army held the Pas-de-Calais coast, not Normandy. The 7th Army, under General Friedrich Dahlmann, was the force actually defending the beaches where the Allies would land. And the 7th Army was never past the warning. 4 days later, on the evening of June 5th, the BBC broadcast the second half of the Verlaine poem at around 9:15 p.m. Paris time, mixed in with hundreds of other coded messages on the same program. This second broadcast ordered resistance sabotage of French railways to begin immediately. Today, a museum sits inside the concrete German bunker in Tourcoing, near the city of Lille, where Meyer's team intercepted that broadcast. The museum is named after the Verlaine message itself. Sources disagree on the exact French wording of that second line, a confusion likely tangled up with a 1940s Charles Trenet song that echoed Verlaine's original phrasing. But the operational meaning was unambiguous to anyone who had been briefed. The Allied invasion of France was about to begin. German Army intelligence informed General Alfred Jodl on the afternoon of June 5th that the 15th Army's security section had detected the second set of Verlaine lines. Jodl and his advisors took no action because the coded lines themselves gave no indication of their meaning to anyone outside the original briefing chain. Colonel General Hans von Salmuth, commanding the 15th Army, sensed something was wrong on his own initiative and ordered his forces onto standby that evening. The neighboring 7th Army, the one that would bear the full weight of the Normandy landing, did not. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because the reason the 7th Army stayed at ease has everything to do with what German meteorologists were saying on their own weather networks. German forecasters had correctly identified a major storm moving into the English Channel, but the Luftwaffe's chief meteorologist went further than the data supported, predicting that rough seas and gale-force winds would persist until mid-June. It was a defensible assessment on its face, and German forecast maps from this period were ironically accurate, in large part because they were intercepting and incorporating Allied weather analysis. Allied meteorologist James Stagg, however, identified something the German forecasters missed entirely: a narrow 36-hour window of calmer conditions opening on June 6th. General Dwight Eisenhower used that window to launch the largest amphibious invasion in history. German command, studying much of the same underlying weather data, concluded the Allies would never attempt a channel crossing in those conditions. That weather forecast was a warning sign for German readiness, and senior command ignored it by leaving their posts across the board. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the architect of the Atlantic Wall coastal defenses, left his headquarters in France on June 5th and drove to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to press Hitler personally for additional panzer divisions. He was hundreds of miles from Normandy when the first Allied paratroopers began descending in the early hours of June 6th. General Dahlmann, the 7th Army commander directly responsible for the Normandy coast, had scheduled a planning war game in Rennes for his division commanders, a tabletop exercise specifically designed to test responses to a hypothetical Allied landing. His officers were on the road to Rennes when the real invasion started, and they had to be recalled and scrambled back to their command posts. By one officer's first-hand estimate, roughly 50% of division commanders and about 25% of regimental commanders were away from their units that night. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, was at his headquarters in Paris, not at the front. Convinced by the Luftwaffe's forecast of 2 more weeks of storms, Wehrmacht commanders across the sector had authorized leave for their men and sent their officers to the Rennes exercises as if there was nothing to worry about. You'd think someone further up the chain would have connected the Verlaine intercept to the empty command posts, but nobody did. And while the German command structure was scattering itself across northern France and Germany, Allied electronic warfare was already working to ensure that whatever monitoring capability remained along the coast would see and hear exactly what the Allies wanted. In the weeks before D-Day, Allied bombers had systematically destroyed German radar installations along the Normandy coastline. 2 independent accounts converge on nearly identical figures. 92 radar stations were targeted in the stretch from the tip of Barfleur to Le Havre, and 74 of them were knocked out. By the morning of June 6th, the radar coverage that might have detected the approaching invasion fleet was largely gone before the fleet even entered the channel. The Allies could have stopped at crippling the radar network, but they were just getting started. In the early hours of June 6th, as the real invasion fleet crossed the English Channel toward Normandy, RAF aircraft and naval ships began dropping massive quantities of metallic chaff. These were strips of aluminum foil cut to precise lengths, matching German radar wavelengths, and they formed clouds of reflective material that appeared as entire fleets on every surviving German radar screen. Operation Taxable simulated a full invasion force heading for Cap d'Antifer, roughly 80 kilometers from the actual landing beaches. Operation Glimmer spoofed a separate fleet approaching Pas-de-Calais, reinforcing the German High Command's pre-existing conviction that the main invasion would come there. A third deception, Big Drum, layered additional radar countermeasures along the real invasion fleet's western flank to distort the true scale and direction of the Normandy assault. While all of this was playing out across the radar screens, something stranger was happening on the ground below. This is the part of the night that involves sound being weaponized in the most literal sense. In the hours before dawn on June 6th, RAF aircraft dropped several hundred dummy parachutists over locations spread across Normandy. The Hessian dummies, codenamed Paragons, were rigged with pyrotechnic noisemakers called pintails, and small explosive charges designed to simulate a soldier burning his parachute after touching down. But the sound deception went well beyond dummies rigged with firecrackers. Small SAS teams who dropped alongside the dummies carried an American loudspeaker system nicknamed Bunsen Burner, and they played 30-minute pre-recorded loops of soldiers shouting orders, rifle fire, and mortar explosions into the pre-dawn darkness. The system could sustain the illusion of a full-scale firefight for up to 6 hours across the French countryside. If you're wondering how convincing a few loudspeakers and some cloth dummies could possibly be in the middle of a real war, consider what the German response actually looked like. At 2 o'clock in the morning on June 6th, German units reported paratroopers landing near Caen, Coutances, Verlaine, and Saint-Lô, along with the sound of ships' engines offshore. 7th Army commanders raised their alert level, but General Hans Speidel lowered it again once patrols reported finding only dummies in the fields. By that point, the damage had already been done. Field Marshal von Rundstedt had ordered the 12th SS Panzer Division to respond to what turned out to be a phantom airborne landing. An entire German infantry regiment spent the morning combing through the woods for a non-existent airborne division instead of moving toward the real invasion beaches at Omaha in Utah. Several SAS personnel who participated in Operation Titanic were killed in action or captured and later executed by the Germans. And then German state radio did something no one on the Allied side had anticipated. At 6:33 a.m. London time, exactly 43 minutes after the opening naval bombardment of the Normandy beaches, Berlin radio went on the air and announced to the world that the Allied invasion had begun. Minutes later, the German news agency Transocean's wire transmission was picked up by the Associated Press. Germany had announced the invasion of its own occupied territory to the global press before the Allies had officially confirmed it was happening. And somehow, it got stranger from there. American and British newsrooms treated the German broadcast with open suspicion for hours, precisely because they expected it might be a deliberate propaganda feint. And roughly half an hour after Berlin's initial announcement, a spokesman on German-controlled Paris radio suggested that the Allies had been given another month of grace before the real invasion would start, reasoning that a planned Roosevelt trip to London later in the month meant the actual attack could not possibly be underway. German propaganda radio was actively talking down an invasion that its own military had just confirmed was real. The choice to dismiss Normandy as a feint reached all the way to the top of the German chain of command, and the delay it caused proved devastating. Hitler did not receive news of the landings until late morning because his staff were unwilling to wake him. When he was finally briefed, he dismissed the Normandy assault as a diversionary attack. Field Marshal von Rundstedt had requested the release of 2 reserve panzer divisions early that morning, but the Wehrmacht High Command hesitated, wondering whether the whole operation was a trap designed to pull reserves away from Pas-de-Calais. Only at a conference around 4 p.m. on June 6th did Hitler finally authorize the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division for deployment to the Normandy coast. By that point, the Allies had been consolidating their beachheads for close to 12 hours, and the night's deceptions outlasted June 6th by weeks. Because Operation Fortitude had convinced German command that Normandy was a diversion and that the real invasion was still coming at Pas-de-Calais, elite panzer divisions and entire reserve formations stayed bottled up in the Calais region for weeks afterward, waiting for a second landing that never came. The signals were all there that night. The Verlaine intercept was correct. The weather data was sound. The radar contacts were real, even if the fleets behind them were not. But the Allies had built a deception so complete, and German command had committed so fully to the wrong forecast and the wrong coastline, that correct intelligence couldn't break through. A signal only matters if the system receiving it is still capable of acting on what it hears.